have been killed after a gas explosion caused a coal mine to collapse in northern Samangan province. The provincial police chief says 8 bodies have been recovered so far from the site in Dara Yusuf Bala district. He added that rescue operations is ongoing. Local residents claim more than 30 workers were inside the mine when it collapsed. The deputy provincial governor said illegal digging and a lack of safety measures were the cause behind the incident. Indian troops have martyred 5 more people in occupied Kashmir's Shopia district. This brings the death toll from violence by Indian troops to 14 in the last 3 days. The civilians were martyred during a cordon and search operation. Indian occupation troops have sealed all of the area's entry and exit points and suspended internet services. Occupied Kashmir has been under a lockdown and communications blackout since August last year, when India stripped the region of its autonomy. Pakistan has summoned a senior Indian diplomat to register its protest over ceasefire violations in Jandrot sector at the line of control. In a statement, Foreign Office spokesperson Aisha Faruqi said Indian forces resorted to unprovoked and indiscriminate firing at the LOC on June 9th. She said the Indian firing resulted in serious injuries to 4 innocent civilians. The spokesperson said Indian occupation forces at LOC and the working boundary have continuously been targeting civilian populated areas. She said Indian forces use artillery fire, heavy caliber mortars and automatic weapons. Faruqi said India has so far committed 1,296 ceasefire violations, resulting in 7 shahadats and serious injuries to 98 innocent civilians this year. Indian side was called upon to respect the 2003 ceasefire understanding and maintain peace along the LOC and the working boundary. The Indian side was also urged to allow the UN Military Observer Group to play its mandated role. Now, Pakistan has recorded its highest single-day surge in coronavirus cases as 5,385 more people tested positive. Over 113,000 infections have been recorded in the country. The Health Ministry says 83 people died in the past 24 hours, taking the death toll to 2,255. And more than 36,000 patients of coronavirus have recovered so far. Officials say the province of Punjab has reported over 43,000 cases, while Sindh has more than 41,000 cases. Latin America continues to be the epicenter of the coronavirus as the number of infected people crossed 200,000 in Peru, while the global COVID-19 death toll has risen to over 411,000 with over 7.2 million infections. More in this report.
The US is fearing a second wave of coronavirus due to massive protests against racism and systemic inequality. But Southern America is facing the brunt of the virus. The World Health Organization has warned the virus is not slowing down anytime soon in the region.
The situation is that while Latin America has had more time, it will take more time to ensure slowing down the peak, the pandemic, and also reaching the plateauing the curve. It will take more time.
In the Far East, the number of deaths and cases have been controlled in South Korea, Japan, and China. But Beijing has warned that disinformation and finger-pointing is not going to make the virus go away.
Recent days have seen an increase in disinformation on COVID-19, especially lies and rumors against China, which has severely poisoned international efforts. Facts have shown that the novel coronavirus is the common enemy of mankind, but what is more horrible than the virus are disinformation, rumors, and slanders spread by people with ulterior motives.
As many states in Europe ease travel restrictions, Germany is taking a more cautious approach. Berlin has extended its travel warnings for non-European countries until August 31st.
Moving on, Turkey says it has killed 8 militants of the Kurdistan Workers' Party in airstrikes in northern Iraq. The National Defense Ministry said counter-terror operations were carried out in the Haftanin and Zap regions. Turkey has killed 11 PKK fighters since yesterday's IED blast in Katak district of Van province. The ministry said Turkey will continue to destroy weapon caches and shelters used by the terrorists. It said over 400 Kurdish militants have been killed in northern Iraq over the past 5 months. The UN says it is concerned over the first airstrike on northwest Syria after the March 5th ceasefire declaration. In a briefing, the bloc spokesperson Stefan Dujarric said over 4 million civilians in the area are at risk after the airstrike. Dujarric said several communities in southern Idlib province were reportedly hit by air attacks. There are no reports of casualties, but civilians have left the areas that were impacted. Dujarric said the scale of the displacement remains unclear. He said the airstrikes add to the ongoing reports of artillery shelling, which also affected communities in the 2 governorates. The UN says it is ready to assist Libya's government to probe the deaths of over 100 civilians killed in Khalifa Haftar's territory. Last week, the government of National Accord found bodies at a hospital in land previously held by forces loyal to Haftar. In a briefing, UN spokesperson Stefan Dujarric said the bodies are the symbol of a high price paid by innocent civilians in the Libyan war. He said it also urged for an immediate ceasefire of hostilities. Dujarric expressed concern at the discovery and called on the GNA to conduct an immediate and impartial investigation. Officials from the GNA said the bodies appear to have been executed and also displayed signs of torture. The EU has called on all parties involved in the Libyan conflict to end military operations and engage in peace talks. In a statement signed by EU's top diplomats, they urged for the withdrawal of all foreign forces, mercenaries and military equipment. EU's foreign policy chief Joseph Borrell and the foreign ministers of France, Germany and Italy signed the document. The joint statement followed increased diplomatic efforts by Germany to push for a political solution to the crisis. Meanwhile, Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan has reiterated his country's support for the Libyan government in its fight against Khalifa Haftar. In a press conference in Ankara, Erdogan said, "We will continue to support our Libyan brothers until peace, tranquility and justice are established." The Organization of Islamic Cooperation is holding an extraordinary virtual meeting over Israel's plans to annex parts of the West Bank. The meeting is being headed by Saudi Foreign Minister Prince Faisal bin Farhan Al Saud in his capacity as chair of the executive committee. The organization said the ministerial-level meeting will follow an open-ended format. Meanwhile, Palestine's Prime Minister Mohammed Shatayyeh says the land seizure will kill any possibilities of peace with Israel. He said it will erode international consensus on a 2-state solution. The UAE says it has delivered a second shipment of medical aid to Palestine via a flight to the Israeli-occupied territories. The aid is the second known Emirati plane to fly from Abu Dhabi to Israel in less than a month. The flight was an aid to Palestinians in the occupied West Bank and the besieged Gaza Strip to curb the spread of the new coronavirus. Palestinian Prime Minister Mohammed Shatayyeh said he was unaware that aid plane from the UAE was to fly to Israel. Shatayyeh said Palestine welcomes aid from around the world if only it is unconditional and coordinated with its authorities. His remarks have cast doubt over whether the Palestinians will accept the supplies. The Palestinians rejected a similar shipment last month, saying it had not been coordinated with them. Now, Russia has warned that US attempts to revive sanctions on Iran will lead to a serious crisis within the UN Security Council. Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov said this during a video conference of the New York Council on Foreign Relations. Ryabkov said it was outrageous how the Washington was trying to freely pick what serves its interests. He said US attempts to nullify the 2015 nuclear deal with Iran not only reject others' perspective but completely defy common sense. Meanwhile, US Special Representative for Iran, Brian Hook, says sanctions on the Iranian regime had produced excellent results. Earlier, Iran's ambassador to the UN, Majid Ravanchi, said that US sanctions during a pandemic amount to crimes against humanity. Russia says it does not oppose the US invitation to China to join nuclear talks, but doubts if Beijing will agree. Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov said it was up to Washington if it wanted to continue the dialogue with Moscow without Beijing. Ryabkov said US allies Britain and France and other smaller nuclear powers should also join the talks. He urged Washington to make a positive proposal while warning that insistence on including China may hamper the negotiations. The Russian diplomat said Moscow expected clarity from Washington over the renewal of the New START treaty. Meanwhile, Beijing said it had no intention of participating in the talks, while accusing the US of deflecting responsibilities onto others. Ryabkov will meet US envoy Marshal Billingsley in Vienna on June 22nd for talks on the long-standing disarmament agreement. China and the EU have agreed to develop closer ties on a range of issues during the 10th round of high-level strategic dialogue. The video conference was co-chaired by China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi and EU's High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Joseph Borrell. Wang said that China and EU are long-term and strategic partners as cooperation always wins over competition. He said both sides should take the 45th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations as a starting point for developing closer ties. While Borrell said the bloc has high expectations for its relations with Beijing. He said EU and China are firm supporters of multilateralism and the bloc welcomes Beijing's active participation in international cooperation. More news coming up after a short break. Stay tuned. George Floyd has been buried in his native Houston 15 days after his murder in custody that sparked global protests against racism and police brutality. The funeral at Houston's Fountain of Praise Church followed a week of memorial services in Minneapolis and the town of Rayford in North Carolina, where Floyd was born. Meanwhile, largely peaceful anti-racism protests have entered their 15th consecutive day. This report has more.
The movement for racial equality and ending decades of racially charged killings in police custody does not look like stopping even after Floyd's burial. A Black Lives Matter group sued the Seattle Police Department to halt the violent tactic it's used to break up largely peaceful protests in recent days. Meanwhile, the US Navy said it is planning to ban the Confederate battle flag from all public spaces on Navy installations. Elsewhere, US President Donald Trump suggested the elderly Buffalo man who was bleeding after being pushed by the US riot police was faking his injury. At Floyd's funeral, civil rights leader Al Sharpton called out President Trump, pointing out wickedness in high places.
You take rubber bullets and tear gas to clear out peaceful protesters, and then take a Bible and walk in front of a church and use a church as a prop. Wickedness in high places. You ain't been walking across that street when the church didn't have the boards up.
In the US Senate, General Charles Brown Jr. was unanimously approved to be the Air Force's Chief of Staff, making him the first Black American in US history to lead a military service. Meanwhile, the state of New York introduced a package of police reform measures. The Democrats-controlled state assembly and the Senate passed a ban on police officers using chokeholds and a full disclosure of racial disparities in policing.
We can give New Yorkers the right to go to court to enforce their rights. We can force the NYPD to do more to identify problematic officers. We can send a message that deadly techniques like chokeholds will not be tolerated. Passing these bills is a step in the right direction.
Meanwhile, Paramount Network has cancelled TV show Cops after a 33-year run amid an outcry over how the series depicts policing.
Activists have drawn up a hit list of 60 monuments in the United Kingdom that celebrate slavery and racism. They suggested it was up to local communities to decide what statues they want in their areas. More in this report.
A wave of anti-racism protests sweeping across the United States and Europe has reignited a debate about monuments glorifying Britain's imperialistic past. Thousands defied social distancing rules to gather at Oxford University and demand the removal of a statue of 19th century British colonialist Cecil Rhodes.
Rhodes represents such a violent legacy of colonialism, imperialism, slavery, particularly in Southern Africa, and the values that he represents are not the values that we stand by and not the values that we think should be celebrated in this community in Oxford. And so, you know, the beginning is to take down a statue that celebrates that so that we can continue to decolonize the university.
Meanwhile, in Leeds, a statue of Queen Victoria has been sprayed with graffiti, including the words murderer and slave owner. The bronze sculpture on Woodhouse Moor in the Hyde Park area of the city also had the words colonizer and racist daubed on it. Meanwhile, a statue of 18th century British slave owner Robert Milligan was removed from outside the Museum of London Docklands. The action followed a decision by Mayor Sadiq Khan to review London's landmarks to reflect the city's diversity.
So this is our contribution from the East End to show solidarity to our brother George Floyd, who was brutally killed in the US, and the movement that's happening throughout the world with Black Lives Matter. East End has a history of standing up against injustice and inequality. And this is our mark by removing a slaver, Robert Milligan, who used to own 526 slaves when he died in 1809.
On Sunday, the statue of slave trader Edward Colston was torn down and thrown into the harbor by protesters in Bristol.
Moving on now, the UK says it will not extend its Brexit transition period with the EU beyond December 31st. During a parliamentary session, the British government's Postmaster General Penny Morton said extension will prolong uncertainty. Morton said there has been no progress on principal issues during last week's fourth round of talks between the EU. She said there are some very tough areas on which two sides have failed to withdraw their hardline positions. She said the government wanted to agree on a deal as early as possible to enable businesses to make preparations. Britain left the bloc on January 31st, but is still following EU rules during a transition period to enable a permanent future trade deal to be reached. Now, with the business news, global financial institution IMF has urged countries to recognize the importance of global trade and guard against retreat from globalization. IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva said this during a virtual event held by US Chamber of Commerce. Georgieva said inequality will increase after COVID-19 pandemic, and it is important to understand that global trade is the only solution. She said almost 90% of the world will be worse off with lower per capita income by the end of 2020. IMF chief said around $100 billion left emerging markets and developing countries in March, which is 3 times more than during the global financial crisis. She also said governments have rolled out fiscal measures totaling $9 trillion globally, which have provided a lifeline to many businesses. She said international community should think about building a recovery that is focused on a great transformation as world emerge from COVID-19 crisis. Libya's largest oil field has restarted operations after it was stormed by unknown armed group, forcing a temporary halt. The petroleum facility's guards announced the decision a few hours after the El Sharara oil field was shut down. El Sharara had resumed production on Sunday after a months-long hiatus. It produces more than 300,000 barrels of crude oil per day, forming roughly one-third of the oil-rich country's production. Khalifa Haftar's forces closed key ports in January, claiming oil revenues are being used by the internationally recognized Libyan government. Libya holds Africa's largest crude reserves, but 9 years of conflict and violence have hobbled production and exports. European stock markets have reversed early gains as investors await the outcome of the US Federal Reserve's latest policy meeting. Travel and leisure sector led the declines with over 2% drop in shares. The stocks of automakers and oil and gas fell between 1 and 2%. This indicates of the Paris CAC 40 and Frankfurt's DAX traded nearly 2% lower. London's FTSE also traded marginally lower. Now it's time for the weather updates. Well, that's all for now. For the latest updates, you can always follow us on social media at indus.news.